As we begin our journey into the world of economics, I thought I would begin with a quote from one of the most famous economists of all times, the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith. And he really is kind of the first real economist in the way that we view it now. And this is from his The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, coincidentally the same year as the American Declaration of Independence. And it's one of the most famous excerpts. He generally, indeed, he being an economic actor, neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. By directing that industry, so the industry in control of that individual actor, in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. He intends only his own gain. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. And this term, invisible hand, is famous. Led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. He's saying, look, when individual actors just act in their own self-interest, that often in aggregate leads to things that each of those individual actors did not intend. And then he says, nor is it always the worse for society that it was no part of it. So it's not always necessarily a bad thing. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So this is a pretty strong statement. It's really at the core of capitalism. And that's why I point out that it was published the same year as the American Declaration of Independence, because obviously America, the founding fathers, they wrote the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. It really talks about what it means to be a democratic country. What are the rights of its citizens? But the United States, in its overall, the overall experience of an American is at least as influenced by the work of Adam Smith, by these kind of foundational ideas of capitalism. And they just both happened to happen around the same time. But this idea is not always that intuitive. Individual actors, by essentially pursuing their own self-interested ends, might be doing more for society than if any of them actually try to promote the overall well-being of society. And I don't think Adam Smith would say that it's always good for someone to act self-interested, or that it's never good for people to actually think about the implications of what they're doing in an aggregate sense. But he's saying that frequently, this self-interested action could lead to the greater good, could lead to more innovation, could lead to better investment, could lead to more productivity, could lead to more wealth, a larger pie for everyone. And now economics is frequently, and when he makes a statement, he's actually making a mix of a microeconomic and a macroeconomic statement. Micro is that individual actors are acting in their own self-interest, and the macro is that it might be good for the economy or for the nation as a whole. And so now modern economists tend to divide themselves into these two schools, or into these two subjects. Microeconomics, which is the study of individual actors. Microeconomics, and those actors could be firms, it could be people, it could be households. And you have macroeconomics, which is the study of the economy in aggregate. Macroeconomics. And you get it from their words. Micro, the prefix, refers to very small things. Macro refers to the larger, the bigger picture. And so microeconomics, just to restate it, is essentially how actors make decisions, or I guess we could say allocations, decisions/allocations of scarce resources. And you're going to hear the word scarce resources a lot when people talk about economics. And a scarce resource is one that you don't have an infinite amount of. For example, love might not be a scarce resource. You might have an infinite amount of love. But a resource that would be scarce is something like food, or water, or money, or time, or labor. These are all scarce resources. And so microeconomics says, well, how do people decide where to put those scarce resources? How do they decide where to deploy them? And how does that affect prices and markets and whatever else? Macroeconomics is the study of what happens in aggregate to an economy. So aggregate, what happens in aggregate to an economy from the millions of individual actors. Aggregate economy. We now have millions of actors. And it often focuses on policy-related questions. So do you raise or lower taxes, or what's going to happen when you raise or lower taxes? Do you regulate or deregulate? How does that affect the overall productivity when you do these? So it's policy, top-down questions. And in both macro and microeconomics, especially in the modern sense of it, there's an attempt to make them rigorous, to make them mathematical. So in either case, you can start with some of the ideas, some of the philosophical ideas or the logical ideas that, say, someone like an Adam Smith might have. So you have these, and they're basic ideas about how people think, how people make decisions. So philosophy of people of decision making, in the case of microeconomics, decision making, and then you make some assumptions about it, or you simplify it. So I'll do you simplify it, and you really are simplifying. You say, oh, all people are rational, or all people are going to act in their own self-interest, or all people are going to maximize their gain, which isn't true. Human beings are motivated by a whole bunch of things, but you simplify these things so that you can start to deal with it in kind of a mathematical way. So you simplify it so you can start dealing with it in a mathematical sense. And this is valuable. It can clarify your thinking. It can allow you to prove things based on your assumptions. And you can start to visualize things mathematically with charts and graphs and think about what will actually happen with the markets. So it's very, very valuable to have this mathematical, rigorous thinking. But at the same time, it can be a little bit dangerous because you're making these huge simplifications. And sometimes the math might lead you to some very strong conclusions which you might feel very strongly about because it looks like you've proven them the same way that you might prove relativity, but they were based on some assumptions that either might be wrong or might be oversimplifications or might not be relevant to the context that you're trying to make conclusions about. So it's very, very, very important to take it all with a grain of salt, to remember that it's all based on some simplifying assumptions. And macroeconomics is probably even more guilty of it. In microeconomics, you're taking these deeply complicated things, the human brain, how people act and respond to each other, and then you're aggregating it over millions of people. So it's ultra complicated. You have millions of these infinitely complicated people all interacting with each other. So it's very complicated. Many millions of interactions and fundamentally unpredictable interactions, and then trying to make assumptions on those, and then doing math with that could lead you to some conclusions or might lead you to some predictions. And once again, it's very important. This is valuable. It's valuable to make these mathematical models, to make these mathematical assumptions, these mathematical conclusions, but it always needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And so that you have a proper grain of salt, and so that you are always focused on the true intuition, and that's really the most important thing to get from a course of economics, so that you can truly reason through what's likely to happen, maybe even without the mathematics. I'll leave you with two quotes, and these quotes are a little bit funny, but they really, I think, are helpful things to keep in mind as you start to especially go deep into the mathematical side of economics. So this right over here is a quote by Alfred Knopf, who was a publisher in the 1900s. An economist is a man who states the obvious in terms of the incomprehensible. And I'm assuming when he's talking about the incomprehensible, he's referring to some of the mathy stuff that you see in economics. And hopefully we'll make this as comprehensible as possible and see that there is value in this. But it's a very important statement he's making. Oftentimes it's stating a common sense thing. It's stating something that's obvious. It's obvious, and it's very important to always keep that in mind, to always make sure that you have the intuition for what's happening in the math, or to know when the math is going in a direction that might be strange based on oversimplifications or wrong assumptions. And then you have this quote over here by Lawrence J. Peter, most famous for Peter's Principles, professor at USC. An economist is an expert who will know tomorrow why the things he predicted yesterday didn't happen today. And once again, important to keep in the back of one's mind, because especially, and this is especially relevant to macroeconomics, because in macroeconomics, there's all sorts of predictions about the state of the economy, what needs to be done, how long will the recession last, what will be the economic growth next year, what will inflation do, and they often prove to be wrong. In fact, few economists even tend to agree on many of these things. And it's very very important to realize that, because oftentimes when you're deep in the mathematics of the economics, it might seem to be a science like physics, but it's not a science like physics. It is open to subjectivity, and a lot of that subjectivity is all around the assumptions that you choose to make. The entire field of economics is based on the idea of scarcity. And arguably, we wouldn't even need a field of economics if there wasn't the notion of scarcity in the world. So what does scarcity mean? Well, think about it. What does it mean in everyday life? It means that there's not enough of something to go around. If we're talking about scarce goods, scarce services, scarce resources, we're talking about things where if there was no cost associated with them, people would use far more of that than there actually is around. And in this video, we're going to think about different types of goods and services, or just resources, and think about whether they are scarce or not. So a related idea to scarce resources is its opposite, which is the notion of a free resource. So this is something that you could argue is infinitely abundant, or at least in a certain context is so abundant that it feels like people can have as much of it as they want. The more that one person has of it, it doesn't take away from someone else. And the reason why scarcity is essential to economics is because economics is the study of how do you allocate these scarce resources. If there's more demand for it than the amount of thing that there is, well, who gets it? How much of it do they get? And what do they have to give up in exchange to get those scarce resources? But for the sake of this video, let's just first make sure we understand and have a good idea of what resources are scarce and which ones aren't, and why. So this is a picture of caviar, which is essentially fish eggs. And it's not easy to get. The fish eggs are deep in the water. Someone has to get to them, and then they have to package it in some way, and they have to get it to your plate. And so, do you think that caviar is a scarce resource or a free resource? Well, if it was a free resource, that means that we're just swimming in caviar, that it's so abundant that I could just have as much caviar as I want, and there's still as much as you want, and that everyone gets as much caviar as they like. Well, that's clearly not the case. Caviar is a scarce resource. In fact, it is a quite scarce resource. And because of that, if you want it, you have to give up a good bit to get it. This is a picture of some people working in a factory. And the resource that jumps out here is that of labor. And labor is interesting because it's not as tangible as something like caviar, but it is a resource. And one could even argue the caviar on your plate, some of its scarcity comes from the labor involved of getting it to your plate. But here, these are clearly, it looks like these are gentlemen who are putting together some type of fabric. And so would you consider labor, would you consider that a scarce resource or a free resource? Well, it would be a free resource if people were willing to just do as much work for other people, actually willing to do an infinite amount of work for other people, which isn't even humanly possible. And even if it was humanly possible, people aren't willing to do that. They want something in return. And so once again, it is a scarce resource. There's many resources that are pictured right here. You have this beautiful town next to this alpine lake. And so some clear scarce resources are here. Many people would love to have a view like you would get from this house or hotel right over here, but not everyone, and many people would love to live there because of the view, but not everyone can live there. So that is a scarce resource. The water here is an interesting one. I could imagine in earlier times, before there was a town here, if there was just a primitive village living next to this fresh water, they would probably view it as a free resource. If someone was thirsty, they would just go up to the lake and they would just drink from the lake. They would not have to give up anything to drink from that. But now the town, it might be a little bit more of a scarce resource. They might want to preserve it for various reasons. In order to get the water to your sink in your house, there might be some services or goods or labor involved. Someone has to set up the pipes. Maybe it has to be cleaned in some way. Well, then it might become a little bit more of a scarce resource. Air, for most of human history, has been considered a free resource. And even today, I'd argue that something like oxygen, at least on our planet, is considered a free resource. When I take a deep breath, it does not affect your ability to take a deep breath. It does not take oxygen away from you. Now, is there an infinite amount of oxygen in our atmosphere? No. But for our purposes, it feels like there's an infinite amount. Now, if the photosynthetic plants were to disappear and all of a sudden the oxygen started to get diminished, or if we were in a space station where there isn't a seemingly infinite amount of oxygen, well then you could imagine a world where it could become a scarce resource. You could imagine a colony on the moon or on Mars or in the space station where it had some type of economic system to decide who gets how much oxygen. So I will leave you there. As already mentioned, scarcity is the central idea in all of economics. It's the reason why we even need a field called economics. And as you go forward in your study of both micro and macroeconomics, we'll be looking at ways to allocate these scarce resources. We'll try to study what people have to give up in order to have access to these resources. And we will have models that will help us understand what are the implications for these different methods of allocating resources. What we're going to do in this video is discuss the difference between normative statements and positive statements. And you'll see these words used usually in an economic context, sometimes a philosophical one. A normative statement is one that really is a matter of opinion, maybe a matter of ethics, something that someone thinks is how the world should be. While a positive statement is something that it doesn't necessarily have to be true, but it's something that can be tested. So what we're going to do in this video is look at a bunch of statements around economics and think about whether they would be classified as normative statements, things that are opinions that are a matter of ethics or morals, or whether they are positive statements, things that can be tested. So let's look at our first statement. This says, paying people who aren't working, even though they could work, is wrong and unfair. So regardless of whether or not you agree with this statement, is it a normative statement or a positive statement? Well, the fact that someone's saying it's wrong and it's unfair, this is pretty clearly a matter of opinion. So this would be a normative statement. You can't test whether this is wrong or unfair. You would just have to believe that it is wrong and unfair. Now let's look at another statement. Programs like welfare reduce the incentive for people to work. Is this a normative statement or a positive statement? Well, it might feel a little normative. It might feel like this is an opinion, but it actually can be tested. You could institute some welfare program on some small scale and compare it to a comparable place where there isn't a welfare program and see what it does for incentives to work. You survey people, you see how many people work in one situation or another. It might be a false statement, it might be a true statement, but either way, it actually can be tested. So this would be a positive statement. So I'll put it in this category right over here. This is a positive statement. All right, let's look at another one. This says, raising taxes on the wealthy to pay for government programs grows the economy. Is that a normative statement or a positive statement? Well, once again, this can be tested. It might be true, it might be false, maybe your test is even inconclusive, but it can be tested. You could try to run a simulation. You could look at case studies of countries that did do this and see what happens to their economy versus ones that didn't do it. And so this is, even though it looks like something that someone who favors raising taxes on the wealthy, maybe out of fairness arguments, something that they would say, this statement itself is not normative. The statement can be tested. So this is a positive statement. A good giveaway for a normative statement, if it said something like, it is fair to raise taxes on the wealthy to pay for government programs, that would have been a normative statement, or we should do this. That would have been a normative statement. But here, this is something that's testable. Now the next statement, raising taxes on the wealthy slows economic growth. Is that normative statement or a positive statement? Well, once again, this might feel like someone who is against raising taxes, who think it's unfair to raise taxes on the wealthy, something that they would say, but the statement itself can actually be tested.
So this is also a positive statement, even though in some ways it's the opposite statement as the one that we just did. Because once again, we could look at countries that did this and countries that didn't do this. We could run a computer simulation to try to understand whether this statement is true. Now let's do one last statement. This says, the government should raise taxes on the wealthy to pay for helping the poor. Is this normative or positive? Well, in this situation, the word should is a pretty big giveaway. Should, or it's fair or unfair. This is someone's opinion. It's not something that's testable. You can't test whether this statement is right or wrong. It's based on, do you believe ethically, morally, that this is true? And so this is a normative statement. So I'll put it in the normative column. So big picture, these words normative and positive, these are fancy words, but all they mean is normative is a matter of morals or opinion and can't really be tested, while a positive statement, whether they're right or wrong or whether you agree or disagree with them, these are things that in theory could be tested. When you think about what the field of economics is about, it is quite daunting. An economy is made up of millions or even billions of actors organized in incredibly complex ways. Right then, this is complex, real world. And each of the actors, human beings or organizations, these are incredibly complex. A human brain, I can't predict what you're going to do the next second, much less what you're going to do the next day or the next year. And imagine trying to make insights about what millions or billions of people will do. But the field of economics has borrowed an idea from other fields. So, for example, in chemistry, chemists have tried to understand at a high level, well, how do molecules in a container behave? Let's say molecules of gas. Well, you could imagine if you have a container here with trillions upon trillions of molecules, this is incredibly complex. But by making some simplifying assumptions about the type of interactions these particles will have or don't have, they can come up with models like the ideal gas law, which you might be familiar with or not from your chemistry class, that relates the pressure to the volume, to the number of particles you have, to the actual temperature. And so this right over here, where you're taking something that's hairy and complex and making simplifying assumptions to help you understand it, this thing right over here is a model. And this is in other fields as well. Sometimes it's not an equation. Sometimes it might be a simpler organism. For example, in biology, human beings are incredibly complex organisms. And not only are they incredibly complex, but certain forms of experimentation would also feel fairly unethical to our modern moral ethos. And so what do biologists do? Well, they make simplifying assumptions, or they pare down, they say, okay, we can't do that study on human beings, but maybe we can simplify the problem by looking at simpler organisms. Maybe you can look at an individual cell right over here. Maybe you can look at things like fruit flies, which are famous in the study of genetics. Maybe you can even look at fairly complex organisms. Even a mouse is a very complex thing, but it's still simpler than a human being, and at least to our modern ethics, we're willing to do certain things to mice that we aren't willing to do to human beings. And so that's why in a biological context, you will hear people talk about things like a mouse model, where they will test a drug on a mouse or try to understand how something happens in a mouse and then say, well, that's pretty good indication that might be happening to human beings. In fact, when they do drug trials in medicine, they often will do it on mice first, and when they have good confidence that it works there and that it's fairly safe, only then will they start to do the experiments on human beings. Well, economists are doing the same thing. Even before the advent of computers and computer models, economists make simplifying assumptions. Assumptions like all of the actors in an economy are rational, which we already know is not exactly true. I'm not always rational, and I definitely know people who aren't always rational. They're simplifying assumptions that all of the people in an economy have the same access to information, or that they all even have perfect information, which we also know isn't necessarily true in a real economy. So depending on the model, there are going to be these simplifying assumptions that take this large, complex, real-world thing and try to break it down into simple equations or lines or charts. We have models early on in our economic study. We will see things like the production possibility frontier, where it assumes that you're only trading off between two things and everything else is equal. This notion of ceteris paribus, which means all things equal. In a real world, you're not going to be able to say, hey, let's just pick between these two things and then hold everything else equal. There's hundreds or thousands or millions of variables are operating. But if you want to make a model, maybe we can make these assumptions. Same thing with famous price equilibria that we're going to study later on, where you have supply and demand, and then you have these notions of equilibrium prices and quantities. These also make similar types of assumptions about rational actors and perfect information. And these economic models can be very useful. And that's why most of your study in a first-year economics course is of these models. Now, with that said, you should also take them with a grain of salt, and you shouldn't just accept them as the absolute description of reality. In fact, that's when economic models can get dangerous. You always have to be conscientious of what are those assumptions you made. In fact, Nobel Prizes have been won in economics by revisiting some simplifying assumptions and coming up with new models. The other difficulty about economics is it's hard to test it in as absolute a way, definitely as something like chemistry or physics. But even in biology, where you're dealing with similarly complex systems, a human body and an economy, these are both extremely complex systems. If I want to see in medicine whether a certain medication works, I can do a clinical trial. I could take hundreds or thousands of people and give maybe half of them the drug, and I could try to control for a bunch of different variables. But in economics, you can't take 1,000 different economies that look very similar in what you think matters and then apply some type of economic prescription to half of them and then see what happens to see whether your model is exactly true or whether your prescription for what makes an economy grow faster actually works. And so the big takeaway, models are valuable across the various sciences, including in economics. But economics straddles between a social science and the sciences like chemistry or physics, because you can't run experiments in the same way. And we often make simplifying assumptions that even though we know aren't exactly true, they're the only way that we're able to make sense of an incredibly complex real world. In this video, we're going to talk about different ways of structuring an economy, and in particular, who owns what, and how does an economy decide what to produce, and who gets the output of that production. So on one side, you have what's known as a command economy. And good examples of command economies are the communist states, especially during the 20th century, the USSR, the Soviet Union being the best example of that. And in a command economy, the government controls what's often known as the factors of production. And sometimes, in an extreme case, there might not even be private ownership. So let's say that this right over here is the government. I'll do this with some type of a building with pillars in it. So this is the government. And in a command economy, the government will often own the factories and the farms, so the factors of production. So let me draw a little factory here. So with a little smokestack. And so the government will tell this factory, this year, you have to produce exactly 10,000 cars. No more and no less. And so that factory say, okay, you're our boss, you're the government, we will produce exactly 10,000 cars. Similarly, the government might tell let's say that this right over here is a farm. And this is my best drawing of a field really fast. And so it needs to say, hey, you need to produce, I don't know, 10 million apples. I don't even know if that's a reasonable amount of apples to produce, but you need to produce 10 million apples. And so the farmers, who essentially work for the government, because the government would own that farm, they would produce those apples. And also in a command economy, there's like, well, who gets these cars and who gets these apples? Well, in an extreme command economy, they will be directly allocated by the government. The government will say, all right, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car. And it might not be based, and in fact, it will not likely be based on any type of who's willing to pay for the car or who could pay the most for the car. Similarly for the apples. So they're all going to be allocated. So there would have to be a lot of planning done on the part of the government to say, okay, how much should we produce of one thing versus another thing? And how do we decide who gets the different things? Now, at the other side of the spectrum, you have what's known as a market economy. And most economies in the world, especially the United States, are much closer to being a market economy than being a command economy. Rather than having the government owning the factors of production and deciding who produces what and how much and who gets those things, in a market economy, it's all based on the factory right over here, independent of the government for the most part, unless you're in certain fields that might have strong influence from the government. Let's say you're a military contractor. But if you're not in one of those fields, if you're fairly independent of the government, what they would say is, well, what does the market need? They might say, hey, look, the market needs 5,000 cars that look like this, but then it also needs another 2,000 trucks that look like that. And how are they basing it? Well, they might have looked in the past year. Well, how well is this car selling? How well is the truck selling? They might look at competitors. In fact, in a market economy, you'll often have more competition. The command economies, you might have one really ginormous factory that's owned by the government or a few, while here you might have competing factories where they're always, hey, they make a pretty good car. We're going to make one that's just as good, and it comes in yellow. So once again, you have this notion of competition for people to produce things out in the market, and they're also making their best judgment of what does the market actually need. Similarly, you could have your farmers here and you say, hey, you know what? I've been growing a lot of apples, but that doesn't seem to be in demand anymore. So I'm going to grow more, I don't know, peaches, because it looks like the sale of peaches, the peaches are in fashion this year. And similarly, who gets these is not dictated by the government. It's determined by the market. And so let's say this is me. Let's say this is you. Let's say this is someone else. If I might not be interested in getting a truck, but I really need to get a new car for my family so I can drive them around and take vacations and things. And let's say you want to get a car too, but the market will dictate who gets it. So for example, the factory might set a price for this car. They might say it is $10,000 per car. And maybe I'm willing to pay it, maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm just like, well, I really like that blue car, but I'm not willing to pay $10,000, and this yellow car is available for $9,000, so I am going to get that. And the prices themselves won't necessarily be fixed. If they're not selling enough of these cars at $10,000, they might lower the price to compete with the yellow car at $9,000. Similarly, if there's a ton of people who are willing to pay the price of this truck, they might raise the price on the truck or produce more of it. And the severe competition, if one firm doesn't do this well on a regular basis, they might go out of business. So there's a strong motivation to be able to meet the needs of the market, and then the prices adjust accordingly. And so you might say, well, what are the positives and negatives that people generally associate with command economies or market economies? Well, the motivation that's often given for a command economy is some notion of fairness, or some notion of equality. That when you have a market economy, as a byproduct of this mechanism where different people are competing, some people are innovating more or less, some people might be working harder or less, some people might just get luckier or unluckier, you naturally will have some level of inequality. And some of the original ideas behind command economies like communism where, hey, we don't like this inequality. We want to see more fairness. And so we want to see everyone get exactly the same car. We want to see everyone get exactly the same number of apples. We don't want to see all of these competing firms. We want one really big, efficient factory to just churn out these cars. Now, it turns out in reality, that's a little bit utopian. Even at the peak of some of these communist economies, there were people who had better access to certain things. People who might have carried favor with the leadership, had more power, who had better apartments, had better cars, had more access to resources than people who didn't. In a market economy, yes, there will be some inequality, but the best thing going for it, and the reason why most economies in the world, even ones that are nominally communist, like the Chinese economy, have transitioned to a market economy, because a market economy is also associated with things like innovation and strong incentives for people to innovate or work or do things. Think about the situation in a command economy. Let's say that you're a manager at this factory here. The government has told you to produce exactly 10,000 cars in exactly the type of model. Maybe you have an idea for how to make this car more efficient, but no one's really going to reward you for that. If you're not going to be able to get paid more so that you can buy more things, you might not be as interested in doing it. While in this situation, you have extreme competition, where as soon as this factory or this company is outselling this one, everyone here is going to think, wow, we need to innovate. We need to really work harder so that we can take more market share from the other company. Similarly, at the individual level, different people might say, hey, I can only afford the yellow car now, but I really wish I had the blue car. So maybe I'm going to work a little bit harder, or I'm going to try to innovate, or I'm going to try to start a business. Most of the world has transitioned to something much closer to a market economy because overall, even though you have this inequality, it has made more productivity, more innovation, more goods and services available to more people. Now, the reality is most economies, as I mentioned, they're close to a market economy, but they aren't a perfect market economy. You still have the government very involved in certain industries. In many economies, the government might be in control of healthcare. The government in almost every country has significant influence in things like the military. The government in, say, the United States, which is considered a fairly capitalist, a fairly strong market economy, the government still does offer social safety nets when the inequality gets too extreme. If someone isn't able to feed themselves, they might get food stamps. If someone isn't able to get healthcare because of poverty, they might get Medicaid. And so there's actually a spectrum between a command economy and a market economy, with most economies actually falling in this in-between state, which is sometimes referred to as a mixed economy. For example, as already mentioned, the United States, which is considered a very capitalist country with a market economy, it still does have some public ownership. The government still does control certain aspects of the economy. It still represents a fairly large chunk of the economy. And so a pure command economy, the government would control everything. Pure market economy, you would have very little that's controlled by the government. But the reality in most of the world, things fall in this mixed economy spectrum.